If you have ever read for clients professionally, or even just for friends and family, or maybe just for yourself on a continuous basis, you may have noticed the tendency for clients to somewhat unconsciously, sometimes more consciously, try and ask the question again if the outcome is unsatisfactory. There is the tendency to want to ask the cards the same question over and over again in the hopes that there might be a different outcome. And traditionally we are taught this is a no-no. We are taught that we should resist this and should avoid doing this ourselves and for clients. And in fact, I myself have often tried to develop strategies for even becoming aware of the subtle ways in which clients will rephrase the question in order that they might get a different outcome that is something more desirable for them. But as time wore on, this notion of asking the cards or asking some form of divination, the same question again and again became a great source of fascination for me. Why is it that we cannot ask the cards, or why is it that we can't ask whatever divination tool we may be using the same question again? Surely if the system of divination we're using is reliable, we should be getting the same answer again, right? And if we're not getting the same answer again, then what does that mean? So this question started to preoccupy me, and naturally I began to experiment with just that. I would ask the cards the same question 2 or 3 times in a row, and I would then journal this. I would wait for the events to unfold and then compare it to these outcomes that I divined multiple times in order to see what the correspondence might be, what the results might show. And what I discovered, in fact, became so important that I structured my entire approach to reading for clients with this information. So, what I also discovered is that this not only had important implications for me as a reader, as a diviner, in order to increase my accuracy, in order to understand divinations and the patterns of time better, but it in fact helped me devise more effective magical strategies since I am a magician. Because clients, when they're coming to me, typically want to hire me to perform magical services for them. And what I discovered allowed me to tailor magical services more precisely to their needs, but also I discovered when magic would be more effective and when it might be less effective as a result of this information. Now, having said that, I guess this is pretty experimental. This is my own weird theory. And I invite you to test it, to check it out, to see what you make of it. Maybe it's useful for you, and maybe it isn't. And in fact, I'd love to get your feedback to hear what you make of this mechanism and how it works for you, not only as a diviner or as a psychic reader or someone who works with divination in some way, but also as someone who works magic. Because for me, a great source of fascination has always been the intersection between divination and magic, and how we can use divination to be better magicians, more efficient magicians, more effective magicians. And I have become convinced that these two components dovetail in a very important way. So as I mentioned, I started experimenting by asking the same question multiple times in a row, and then comparing these different outcomes in order to discern a pattern. So this is what the technique that I'm going to demonstrate to you, and we're going to try and see what patterns we can discern. So in order to do this, you will need 3 divination tools. And these could be different oracle decks, or they could be different tarot decks, or you might even combine, for example, horary astrology and tarot and geomancy. Whatever the case may be, you will want to combine three different individual methods of divination in order to experiment with this. And for simplicity's sake, I've chosen two tarot decks. I've chosen the Morgan Greer, the Rider-Waite, and the Lenormand. And for the very simple reason that these three, I've got these as miniature decks, and they all fit on my table and on my camera's screen space. So that's what I've gone with here. I've also brought along Mercury here again, Lord of Divination. Someone asked me where I got him. In fact, I bought this in Rome at the Colosseum, at the gift shop at the Colosseum. But he's going to come along for the ride. And as I was saying, you will need three divination tools. Now, you could do this with two, you could do it with 4 or 5, but I find 3 works well enough to get the effect, or to demonstrate this at least. And you could even do this with 3 tarot decks. And I do suggest that you use 3 different decks, rather than asking the same question 3 times with the same deck. And for the simple reason that it can be interesting to see if the same cards in the decks come out each time, and that kind of thing. So those kinds of patterns can be interesting, this is how I've normally done it. And in fact, if you've come to me for a reading, you will notice that I usually read with 3 or 4 different tools. I will read with the tarot, I will read with the Lenormand, I'll read with geomancy, and I will read with the gypsy cards. And I will often enough combine them all 3 into the reading, or at the very least, I will combine all 3 forms of cartomancy into one reading. And in effect, what I'm doing is I'm asking the same question 3 times. Now, using multiple decks in one reading is not particularly revolutionary. A lot of readers do this because they like to have lots of decks in the reading. But what is specific to my approach is that I'm asking each deck the same question. And that's what we're going to do in this example. So, say for instance, you are wanting to know whether you and an ex will be getting back together, and you throw the cards and you ask the same question: will my ex and I be getting back together? Will we be reconciling? And you ask it each time with a different oracle. So you first ask it with the Morgan Greer, you ask it with the Rider-Waite, and then you ask it with the Lenormand, right? And let's say that this was the result. And often enough, and in about 70% of the cases, I discovered that there will be a strong correspondence amongst these outcomes. That if it was very unlikely for the two of you to reconcile, that it would be reflected across all 3 answers. So here, for instance, we have, oversimplifying for the sake of this example, but here we'd have 3 pretty bad readings. We've got death in the outcome there, we've got the moon and the devil in the outcome, we've got the mountain here in the outcome, and more or less we are seeing that in each case, even though we've repeated the answer 3 times, there are 3 negative outcomes, right? And often enough, this seems to be the case, especially if the outcome of the situation is fairly the course that has been set for that event is already in motion, or it's very much it's already in formation, you could say, right? Then there is likely to be this repeated answer, or at least, even though the specifics might not necessarily be the same, in general there would be 3 negative answers. There might be slight variances in the specifics of what these cards are saying, but there will be generally a sense of no across all 3, and that's what I like to refer to as congruence. There's a strong degree of congruence amongst these 3 answers, or amongst the, no matter how many times I asked this question, there was a congruence in this answer. So that's the first thing that could happen. There is this strong congruence across the repetition of the question. Of course, there is an alternate thing that could happen here. So the second possibility that can happen if we're asking the same question 3 times in a row, and for simplicity's sake I've just used 3 card readings here because it will fit on the screen, but of course you could be asking the same question with a bigger reading, you could be using different spreads, it doesn't matter, but the main idea is having repeated the same question multiple times in a row and then observing the answer that would produce and then comparing these answers. So the second possibility, of course, is to receive a mixed reading. So in the tarot, Morgan Greer here might be seemingly giving us a no. It doesn't look like we will be reconciling. And then the Rider-Waite appears to be saying yes. Yeah, we've got the Empress there in the outcome. So that's leading towards a positive conclusion. And then the Lenormand seeming to be talking about something having to do with finances, having to do with a home, and so on. And there's all these mixed signals here. Now, the first logical conclusion that you might come to is that this is nonsense, that this somehow disproves the efficacy of divination, and that this answer is meaningless because the answers are somewhat contradictory or entirely contradictory, and therefore it makes no sense and we should ignore this reading. And obviously, because I'm doing this demonstration and because I'm a diviner and a reader, that is not a conclusion I'm willing to make. So what is the conclusion that I derive from this? And what I have come to believe from this exploration is the following: that in this case, we might say that the situation is still in flux, that we could look at the situation, we could look at this reading as describing 3 possible futures or 3 alternate realities that are going to unfold in the coming time. And on the one hand, this volatility in a reading is problematic because it warns that the situation isn't clear, that it is unpredictable what is going to happen next, and therefore, in some sense, it really is difficult to predict the outcome, right? Because somehow we have this the road forking into 3 very distinct patterns. The pattern of time is kind of bifurcating and creating these 3 avenues of manifestation, possible manifestation, which on the surface may seem to not offer us any clarity. But if we think about it more closely, we will see that this is in fact offering a hopeful picture. And this is what I discovered. When the cards are highly congruent, and let's say the answer is a positive one, then it would seem that there is an aspect of this outcome which is more fated, that it's somehow the pattern of time or the parameters of what is possible in the coming period has solidified in such a way that that is more or less certain to happen. It's definitely going to happen. And if it's positive, then hooray, all things are going to go well. We don't need to do that much. And often, that is what I discern in the reading, I might not even want to prescribe spiritual work for the client to help expedite that, because to my way of thinking, that would be a waste of energy and an effort, seeing as that it seems to be more or less fated to happen on some level. Right, and then of course the downside of that is if the reading is all negative, if the answer is repeated 3 times and all 3 readings seem to suggest a no, that too seems to be fated on some level, or let's say that the variabilities have solidified in such a way that it would be very difficult to influence the pattern of events significantly, and for similar reasons magic would then become much harder. However, if this is the reading that is produced by asking the same question 3 times, where in effect there seems to be this sense of changeability and flux, the sense that there are 3 very distinct outcomes. It would suggest that nothing has fixed just yet, and in fact magic is more likely to influence events, and in some sense we can now select which one of these outcomes we would prefer, and we can push events in that direction. And not only can we do that magically by using spell works in an explicit way, but even by divining carefully and checking what the advice in each one of these readings might be, certain particular actions might trigger one of these outcomes to become more likely. So this mechanism therefore has become the foundation of my method of reading. And very simply what I do is I use 3 or 4 different tools simultaneously, as I mentioned, and then I will basically ask the same question multiple times using the 3 different tools or 4 different tools, and then I will compare the outcomes, and I will see if there is a high degree of congruence. I will know that to some extent the events that are predicted by that across all those oracles, because of that congruence, are, you could say, fated, that the pattern of time has become very fixed, and that influencing events, there is less wiggle room. But alternatively, what I have discovered is that if there is a lot of variability in the outcomes, one outcome is more positive, one outcome is more negative, or maybe one is kind of mixed and one is very positive, one is very negative, then that to me would suggest a situation that is in flux. And on the one hand, that is a downside because it suggests a lot of volatility in the situation, which can be quite anxiety producing for both the client or for yourself if you're reading for yourself, because uncertainty is scary. But on the other hand, that can turn out to be a very resourceful place to be in, for this very reason that I just described, because it somehow suggests that there are these alternate futures that could exist, and that because things are volatile and because the pattern of time hasn't quite fixed along a very particular track, we can now influence events to go in any direction we want, and we can more or less select the future that we would rather have. Of course, for a magician, this is a very exciting place to be, because it shows that our spell work is much more likely to take effect and take us into the direction that we want, and it turns out that chaos can be a very fertile ground. So there you have it. I hope that was at least interesting for you. Please share your thoughts about this in the comment section. If you experiment with this, definitely let me know. I'd love to hear how it works for you. And as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like or to subscribe, and all the best to you.